It's very interesting that that could have been the case, because you would think that they would be in many ways at loggerheads with one another, and yet both Nixon and Johnson came from kind of similar, not wealthy backgrounds. They come from very humble backgrounds, each one of them. And while Hubert Humphrey worked closely with LBJ in the Senate, I also get the impression, from having read Robert Caro, that he didn't necessarily have a lot of respect for Humphrey in the Senate. He literally, kicked him once or twice in order to get him going on doing something that he wanted. So that's fascinating that might be the case, that he sort of tacitly approved of the Nixon campaign, and it seems to me that post presidency they did communicate a fair amount, from what I've read as well.
Well, and a lot of those records have not been opened. I've really been working hard. The LBJ Library is a great place to do research. The staff is just great. But a lot of LBJ's post-presidency records, which might or might not, my mind's open, of course, document further what Johnson's reflections on the Nixon presidency are just beginning to be opened. But I think in essence, I can't explain it any better than his daughter Lucy did to me, who said, look, on the surface, they were very different politically, Johnson and Nixon. They had different policies. But some of the other Johnson people said that Johnson believed to be president, you had to have a killer instinct. Mm-hmm. And while Humphrey was a wonderful human being, I think he was a very loyal, decent, good vice president, especially in the civil rights era. And he was more than just an also-ran. I think he was someone who really could have been president. I think in the end, Nixon and Johnson might not have been drawn together by their similarities on the surface, but in other ways, as you hint at, the humble upbringing. Both were very aware they didn't go to the best. They didn't go to prep school. They didn't go to the best colleges. Nixon at Whittier, Johnson at what is now Texas State and San Marcos, Texas.
San Marcos Teachers College, I believe it was at the time.
Yeah, as it was back then, absolutely. They both had, Lady Bird's diary said, I overheard Mr. Nixon refer to Georgetown dinner parties, exactly the way that Lyndon might have said it.
Right.
The national media looked down on them, the elites in their parties, the establishment. And I think those were, powerful forces that might have brought them together. And I think one final point I would add, which is you look at any modern presidency, I think it's difficult to find two that are more connected. In many ways, the Nixon presidency is a continuation of the Johnson presidency. Now, it's not necessarily written up that way in any book you pick up, but I've really come to believe this. Certainly the Vietnam War was completely unsettled by the time Nixon was sworn in. Yeah. So many of the domestic issues, and Nixon ultimately no more ended the Great Society than Eisenhower did the New Deal. Right. The size of government didn't shrink during Nixon's presidency. It grew, and certainly his domestic policy was quite expansive for a Republican, which makes me potentially, going beyond this book, view the Nixon presidency, or at least the first term, in a very different way. That the most important constituent that President Nixon had was one voter down at the ranch in Stonewall, Texas, who was a powerful force, against a House and a Senate, which was controlled by the other party for Nixon the entire 5.5 years he was president. So it's the book, in a way, goes beyond just an election in 1968, and I think really calls into question all that there is about politics that might not really be as it seems. Yeah, at least sometimes.
And certainly LBJ had very long tendrils that extended onto Capitol Hill beyond his presidency, and he was associated with very powerful commercial forces that could make their influence known beyond his personal political persuasiveness. I'm wondering what change in the dynamic took place between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon once you see the entry into the race of George Wallace. How did that change the dynamic of what was going on?
Oh, I think Wallace might be the most fascinating part of the whole campaign. This is something that Americans, we don't see very often in elections. I'm always reminded whenever you vote, you see kind of the right at the very top are the two major candidates and the
Yeah.
parties, and then you let your eyes kind of pan down, and usually you see a bunch of candidates and parties that maybe you haven't heard of in some cases.
Yeah.
This is one of those rare elections. We probably haven't had it since maybe Ross Perot of a third party or a third, we have no labels being thrown around, third party, third candidate that really potentially makes a difference. And Wallace polled as high as 20 some percent, 23%. He won 10 million votes ultimately. And I think it was really the first time you had a kind of 50 state, because he got on the ballot at all 50 states, which is not easy to do,
Yeah.
to navigate 50 sets of laws, 50 sets of legal challenges from both major parties. Nothing brings the two major parties together more quickly across the aisle than 30-party challenges. And Wallace, I think, really had this kind of anti-elite, anti-establishment campaign
Yeah.
that's been, in a sense, the playbook for populists in both parties, but especially Republicans recently. I would argue ever since. It kind of struck a nerve. The idea that the phrase drain the swamp, I don't think ever occurred to George Wallace, but if it had, he might have used it. And so this is kind of a fascinating, something about this campaign transcended Alabamians, it transcended the South, and it really kind of struck a nerve. I mean, the last president to win the working class, the blue collar, the lower middle class votes as a bloc, was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And their votes have largely been up for grabs ever since as the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. And so to me, this is a fascinating element of 68, but also one to keep an eye on for this next year.
And it was a time also when the Democrats were still actively courting voters in the South. So it wasn't something that, as might be seen in this day and age, where a right-wing populist candidate was only going to impact the Republican Party. The Democrats were very concerned about it also.
Well, that's exactly right. Back then, you could be conservative and be a Democrat or a Republican.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads to, I think, the other thing that Wallace really changed about the race is, much has been written up about, say, Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968. Anybody can Google Nixon's Southern strategy and read up on that. But again, my take is a little different. That with Wallace in the race, that changes everything. Because neither Nixon or Humphrey really need to have a Southern strategy. They could concede basically the whole Deep South.
Right.
They weren't going to match Wallace's rhetoric, certainly not his message for those voters. Any voters who were motivated more singularly on the issue of race are going to go for Wallace anyways, and not even hear what Nixon or Humphrey has to say. So I think Wallace really changes that whole race. And I think if it had been a two-man race, Nixon and Humphrey, it would have been very different in terms of messaging, because each would have had to compete head-to-head for those voters in the South. So I think that's another major way that the presence of Wallace, on the ticket really changed both the Nixon and the Humphrey strategies.
Do you think that there are circumstances, if they had gone slightly differently, that would have seen a Humphrey presidency come into being? What were the major factors, do you think, in Nixon defeating Humphrey in that year?
Nixon was often criticized for being sort of boring, unexciting. And I think in 1968, that was also an asset. People wanted to sort of escape the chaos of the year. Not that you could argue they really ultimately did. We're a few years from Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War. But historians aren't supposed to engage in what if history or counterfactuals. But that's exactly why your question is so fascinating. As I said, I think Humphrey was more than just an also-ran who becomes anonymous in some election. I think he's somebody who really could have been president. He was really gifted as a politician, kind of sensing the barometer of political opinion. I wonder whether his best window might not have been 1960, when he was eviscerated in the West Virginia primary by the Kennedys.
Right.
There was no Vietnam War, which was not a strong suit of his. The nation was more looking inward, focused on domestic issues, which were all the strengths of Humphrey. I would say in 68, really the conservative vote was divided. So a lot of those conservative Democrats went to Wallace or maybe to Nixon. And so the Democratic Party was divided. You know, if Humphrey had, say, an outgoing Texas Governor John Connally on the ticket, that might have done it. Because instead, we see again the Billy Graham diary shows that Graham intervenes in Chicago and tells Connally, in exchange for your refusal to go on the Humphrey ticket, a Nixon presidency will offer you a cabinet post. Again, all the ways that Graham was behind the scenes, kind of working to lay the ground for a Nixon presidency. But I think ultimately it's Humphrey's. He was so skilled, but he wasn't skilled enough to manage that relationship with Johnson. As the outgoing president. And you look at any election where there is a sitting vice president, it's the most difficult campaign to organize around a meaningful theme. I mean, isn't that long ago? I remember Al Gore in 2000.
Right.
And in some parts of the country, it was a strength to deploy the outgoing President Bill Clinton. And in other places, you didn't want to appear with them. And Hillary Clinton had a bit of that. I mean, she wasn't the vice president in 2016, but she was seen as a major figure as Secretary of State. And it was the same kind of question. When do you deploy him and when do you stay far away from him? And Nixon had just done that in 60, losing narrowly to John F. Kennedy. That he also struggled to know when do you use Eisenhower and when do you don't. So I think that gave Nixon kind of a slight edge in 68 because he knew how hard Humphrey had it.
Yeah, because LBJ wasn't there to be used.
well, exactly. And put yourself in the situation. You have to argue that everything we've done in the last 4 or 8 years is perfect. Yet somehow it's also unfinished, and even better things are ahead, which, of course, a cynic says, if they're so great, why didn't you do them already? So it's really tough to both kind of have more in the tank, but yet you have this impeccable legacy to defend. And it's a very awkward act for any vice president, but in particular that year, when not just the nation was divided, but the political parties were divided. The younger generation was divided against an older generation. I mean, I would argue that we really never saw, Humphrey, the political genius in 68. He was really never able to operate on all cylinders like he was earlier in his career.
Yeah. We didn't see the echoes of the 1948 convention speech that he gave on the civil rights platform. In a way, I mean, he's shown amazingly in that, and just in 1968 there was nothing comparable, especially given the context of the Chicago convention that year, which was so violent and so disruptive. Well,
I think another lesson too that's a parallel to today is so many Democrats back then weren't excited about Humphrey. So many Republicans weren't excited about Nixon. I think both parties, we really wanted other options.
Right.
And it's one of those elections, a bit like our own era today, when the motivations behind how people vote is kind of hard to figure out. That a lot of times people are voting for reasons other than the name on the ticket. It might be against, the other side, or it might be for or against some particular issue that's important to them. But I think 68 was a bit like that, where kind of Americans kind of held their nose and pulled the lever, and that's what we got.
That's very interesting to me because, I mean, the next question, the final question that I intend to ask here is a weird and a difficult one, and it's one that often sums up in an interview when you're talking about history, is like, what are the lessons? What are the lessons for today? But the landscape is so thoroughly different in 2024 coming into that year than 1968 was. It's very tough to kind of sum up, like, what can we learn from 1968? Certainly that, right-wing populists can have a very strong impact, if nothing else, we saw from the 2016 election. But what does that tell us about now? Well, like, what can we learn about 2024 from 1968, given all the differences, and they are many, and the few key similarities between what was going on then to what is happening now?
Well, it's 55 years after 1968, and we're just trying to make sense of what really happened.
Right.
And I hope I'm around, but it might take that long to make sense of our own era. Nixon's longtime speechwriter, Ray Price, always said, the 1860s was an actual civil war. the 1960s was a proxy civil war, and more people